A photograph can lie, a passport can be forged, a bank account can hide blood money behind Swiss discretion, but a face, surgically transformed by skilled hands in a private clinic somewhere between Beirut and Geneva, can make the most wanted man in the Middle East vanish into a European crowd as if he had never committed a single act of terror. Someone had been erasing identities for 17 years. Someone had been giving monsters new lives. Someone was about to meet the only actress trained to kill. The spring of 1997 marked a critical turning point in the operational capabilities of Hamas, when Israeli intelligence officers analyzing surveillance footage from 3 separate terrorist attacks in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv noticed a disturbing pattern that would consume the next 7 years of Mossad operations across Europe and the Middle East. 5 commanders, who had orchestrated bus bombings and cafe attacks between 1994 and 1996, had seemingly vanished from all known safe houses, family connections, and traditional Hamas networks, only to resurface months later in European capitals with completely different facial features that rendered standard recognition protocols utterly useless, despite the fact that their fingerprints, when eventually recovered from crime scenes, matched perfectly with individuals Israeli intelligence had declared neutralized or captured. The transformation went far beyond simple disguises or basic cosmetic alterations, involving sophisticated surgical procedures that restructured bone, cartilage, and soft tissue in ways that suggested the involvement of a highly trained plastic surgeon with access to advanced medical facilities and a complete understanding of how intelligence agencies built their facial recognition databases. Someone who understood that changing a nose or adding a scar would never be enough to fool Mossad. Analysts who had memorized every angle of these faces during hundreds of hours studying attack footage. Mary Levi had spent 19 years preparing for roles she would never perform on any legitimate stage. Training that began when she was 15 years old, and a Mossad recruiter noticed her performing Medea in a Tel Aviv theater production with an intensity that made 3 audience members leave during the child murder scene because they could not separate the actress from the character she inhabited with such complete psychological transformation. The recruiter, a woman named Rachel who claimed to work for the Ministry of Culture, attended 4 more performances before approaching Mary's parents with an opportunity that would require their daughter to study theatre in London and Paris, while simultaneously training in disciplines that had nothing to do with Chekhov or Shakespeare, learning instead how to build cover identities that could withstand background checks from intelligence services in 12 countries, how to seduce targets who had been trained to resist seduction, how to read micro-expressions that revealed lies in the half-second before someone's conscious mind could construct a believable deception, and most critically, how to kill without hesitation when a mission required permanent solutions to problems that threatened Israeli security. By the time she turned 34 in 2003, Mary had operated under 17 different identities across Europe, South America, and Southeast Asia, playing roles that ranged from a German journalist investigating war crimes in Bosnia to an Argentine art dealer laundering money through galleries in Buenos Aires, each assignment building toward the moment when Avi Shaltiel would finally authorize her deployment against the target Mossad had been hunting since 1987 without success. Dr. Karim Bashir had transformed 43 faces since he performed his first procedure for Hamas in 1987, a number that Mossad calculated by cross-referencing surgical supply purchases from 7 clinics across Lebanon, Switzerland, and southern France, with the disappearance dates of known terrorists and their subsequent reappearances in locations where Israeli intelligence had not expected to find them alive. The doctor operated from a network of private facilities that changed locations every 6 to 8 months, never maintaining a permanent residence or office that intelligence agencies could monitor consistently, never using the same set of nurses or anesthesiologists twice, never keeping patient records longer than 48 hours after a procedure, when he would personally burn all documentation in industrial incinerators that left nothing but ash and trace metals that told investigators absolutely nothing useful about surgical techniques or patient identities. 5 Mossad agents had died attempting to infiltrate his network between 1992 and 2001, each operation ending when Bashir's security apparatus, which included former Mukhabarat officers from Syria and retired Stasi agents from East Germany, detected surveillance or identified background inconsistencies in the cover identities that the Mossad had constructed with insufficient preparation time and inadequate understanding of how deeply Bashir vetted anyone seeking access to his services. The breakthrough came in January of 2003, when Yael Cohen, a 29-year-old financial analyst working in Mossad's banking intelligence unit, identified a pattern in wire transfers moving through Credit Suisse accounts that connected Jean-Pierre Beaumont, a banker in Geneva who specialized in high-net-worth clients from the Middle East, to a series of shell corporations that had purchased medical equipment shipped to addresses in Cannes and Monaco during months when Bashir's surgical activity showed increased volume, according to separate intelligence streams tracking Hamas commander movements. Yael had spent 14 months building a network map that connected 47 bank accounts, 19 shell corporations, and 12 real estate holdings to transactions that totaled approximately 38 million euros since 1998, discovering that Beaumont attended the Cannes Film Festival every May without fail and always stayed at the Hotel Martinez in a suite overlooking the Croisette, where he entertained clients who traveled from Beirut, Damascus, and Amman under the cover of being film investors or production company executives seeking European distribution deals. Avi Shaltiel had run operations in Europe for Mossad since the First Intifada began in 1987, surviving missions that killed colleagues and transformed his understanding of how far Israel's enemies would go to protect their networks from penetration by foreign intelligence services. He reviewed Yael's analysis 3 times before calling Mary into his office at Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv during the first week of March 2003, spreading surveillance photographs across his desk that showed Beaumont at the previous year's festival alongside a man whose face had been digitally reconstructed from partial images captured by French security cameras, a face that analysts believed belonged to Bashir, despite the fact that no definitive identification had been possible, because the doctor never looked directly at any camera and always positioned himself to avoid creating clear facial profiles that recognition software could analyze effectively. The operation plan covered 47 pages and required Mary to become Claudia Moretti, an Italian actress who had appeared in 3 independent films distributed at European festivals between 1999 and 2002, a cover identity that had been constructed over 4 years using legitimate acting work that Mary performed under her alias while simultaneously maintaining her readiness for Mossad deployment whenever Tel Aviv required her specialized skills. Marco Santini would play her producer, arriving at Cannes 2 days before Mary to establish his presence among the festival crowds and create opportunities for engineered encounters with Beaumont that would position Claudia as an actress seeking financing for a French-Italian co-production about resistance fighters during World War II, a project designed to appeal to Beaumont's documented interest in European history and his weakness for associating with celebrities who validated his self-image as a sophisticated cultural patron rather than a banker who enabled terrorism through financial services. The festival began May 14, 2003. Mary landed in Nice 6 days earlier. Everything that followed would force her to choose between the actress she pretended to be and the killer she actually was. The Hotel Martinez had witnessed 70 years of cinema history unfold across its Art Deco terraces, hosting legends who arrived in limousines and left behind scandals that tabloids would dissect for decades. But the staff who worked the night shifts between 2 and 6 in the morning had learned to recognize patterns that separated legitimate guests from intelligence operatives who booked suites 3 months in advance using credit cards linked to production companies that existed only on paper and whose corporate addresses led to answering services in Luxembourg. Mary checked into room 412 on May 8, 2003, carrying 2 Louis Vuitton suitcases that contained designer dresses purchased in Milan, specifically for this operation. Italian fashion magazines with pages marked to suggest an actress studying current trends, and a BlackBerry phone modified by Mossad technicians to transmit encrypted communications through a signal that French counterintelligence would mistake for standard cellular traffic if they happened to monitor communications from guests they suspected of conducting espionage activities during a festival that attracted intelligence officers from 20 countries who used the crowds and parties as cover for operations that had nothing to do with cinema. She unpacked methodically, arranging Claudia Moretti's life across surfaces that would be photographed by anyone who entered the room while she was absent, creating a tableau of an actress obsessed with her craft through annotated scripts, photographs from previous film sets, and handwritten notes about character motivation that demonstrated the kind of dedication to detail that would make her cover story withstand scrutiny from professionals trained to detect deception. Marco Santini had established his presence among the festival's pre-opening social circuit by May 10th, attending 3 parties hosted by distributors and sales agents who controlled access to the market, where independent films competed for theatrical releases and streaming platform acquisitions that could transform modest productions into profitable ventures or consign them to obscurity despite positive critical reception. He cultivated relationships with calculated precision, mentioning Claudia's name in conversations with producers who might repeat it to the right people, describing her previous work in terms that generated curiosity without overselling her achievements, positioning her as an emerging talent whose combination of classical training and modern sensibility made her ideal for projects seeking artistic credibility alongside commercial viability. A description designed to reach Jean-Pierre Beaumont through the network of connections that linked festival insiders to the banker who funded film investments as both money laundering operations and genuine attempts to associate himself with creative endeavors that elevated his social status beyond his primary occupation, facilitating financial crimes. The strategy required patience and precision because approaching Beaumont directly would trigger suspicion from someone whose survival depended on recognizing when people wanted something from him that went beyond simple business transactions. Someone who had spent 16 years protecting Bashir by identifying threats before they could materialize into operations that endangered the doctor's freedom or his lucrative arrangements with clients who paid premium rates for surgical anonymity. Mary first saw Beaumont on May 13th at a cocktail reception hosted by Unifrance at the Grand Hotel, where French producers mingled with international buyers in a salon overlooking the Mediterranean, while waiters circulated with champagne and canapés that guests consumed while discussing films they had not yet seen, but would praise or condemn, based entirely on whether those films aligned with their commercial interests or ideological preferences. The banker stood near the terrace doors, wearing a navy suit tailored in London, speaking with a German distributor about a documentary on Vichy collaboration that had generated controversy during its premiere at the Berlin Film Festival 3 months earlier, because it presented evidence that implicated families still prominent in French politics. Families with sufficient power to pressure festival organizers into relegating the film to midnight screenings where smaller audiences reduced its Cultural impact despite its historical significance. Mary watched from across the room, noting how Beaumont controlled conversations through subtle dominance behaviors, how he positioned himself to force others to turn their backs to the crowd when speaking with him, how his eyes tracked women's movements with an assessment that calculated attraction and availability simultaneously, identifying targets who might provide opportunities for relationships that served purposes beyond simple physical pleasure. She approached the bar and ordered Campari with soda, timing her movement to intersect with his path when he inevitably moved toward the terrace for air after 20 minutes in the overheated salon. The collision happened exactly as she choreographed it, her glass striking his shoulder hard enough to splash orange liquid across his lapel and create the kind of socially awkward moment that demanded apologies and extended conversation to diffuse embarrassment through shared laughter about expensive suits ruined by clumsy actresses who should watch where they walked. Mary performed mortification with the authenticity that came from years of training and natural talent, pressing napkins against the stain while speaking rapid Italian that mixed genuine distress with flirtatious concern, creating intimacy through the physical proximity required to clean the damage, while Beaumont responded with the practiced graciousness of a man accustomed to women, creating opportunities to touch him and speak closely enough to make their intentions unmistakable. He switched from French to Italian, surprising her with fluency that suggested extensive time in Milan or Rome, asking about her work with an interest that seemed genuine until she recognized the micro-expressions that revealed his questions served intelligence-gathering purposes rather than simple curiosity about her career, noting how he paused fractionally before certain questions to calculate what information her answers might provide about her finances, connections, and susceptibility to manipulation through flattery or material incentives. Marco appeared at precisely the right moment, greeting Beaumont with the familiarity of someone who had encountered him at previous festivals, introducing Claudia as his discovery from the Rome theatre scene, and describing her recent work in terms that emphasized her dedication to roles requiring psychological complexity rather than physical beauty, though he acknowledged with calculated charm that she possessed both qualities in combinations that directors found irresistible when casting female leads who needed to carry emotional weight throughout narratives that demanded audiences invest in their character's journey. Beaumont requested her card, mentioned a dinner party he was hosting on May 16th at a restaurant in Le Souquet, where distributors and financiers would discuss projects seeking European co-production funding, and suggested that Marco bring Claudia if their schedule permitted attendance at what he promised would be more interesting than the official festival parties where everyone performed networking rituals that rarely resulted in actual business relationships worth maintaining beyond superficial exchanges of contact information. 3 days passed in choreographed preparation, Mary attending screenings and parties where she built Claudia's presence among people who would remember meeting an Italian actress when Beaumont eventually asked about her background, creating a foundation of witnesses who could confirm her cover story because they had actually interacted with her in contexts that seemed to have nothing to do with any intelligence operation. Yale sent encrypted updates through the modified BlackBerry about banking activity, showing unusual transfers that suggested Bashir might be preparing for a major procedure, possibly involving a high-value client whose identity remained unknown, but whose payment schedule indicated someone important enough to justify mobilizing the doctor's full security apparatus. Avi transmitted authorization to proceed with accelerated timeline if opportunity presented itself during the dinner party. May 16th arrived with unseasonable rain. The restaurant overlooked the harbor. Mary wore a black dress that cost €4,000. Beaumont greeted her with a kiss on each cheek that lasted precisely 1 second longer than professional courtesy required. Everything that happened during the next 4 hours would determine whether 17 years of hunting would end with Bashir in an interrogation room or with another dead Mossad agent whose body would be discovered in circumstances that French authorities would attribute to accidents or criminal violence unconnected to intelligence operations, just as they had concluded about the previous 5 agents who had tried to penetrate Bashir's network and failed to return from missions that left no evidence of their actual objectives. The restaurant Le Chanticleer occupied the ground floor of a renovated 17th-century building whose stone walls had absorbed centuries of conversations between merchants, smugglers, and tourists, who never suspected that certain private dining rooms hosted meetings where money moved through handshakes and promises that would never appear in any written contract or banking record subject to government scrutiny. Beaumont had reserved the back salon, a space that seated 12 guests around a table positioned beneath a Murano chandelier whose amber light created an atmosphere of old-world sophistication that appealed to clients who wanted to feel they were participating in traditions that preceded modern financial regulations and international anti-terrorism agreements that complicated the movement of capital across borders without raising alerts from agencies designed to detect exactly the kind of transactions that Beaumont facilitated through his network of Swiss accounts and shell corporations. Mary entered at 8:45, deliberately arriving after most guests had settled into their seats, so her entrance would create a moment of disruption that allowed her to observe room dynamics, while others adjusted to accommodate the latecomer, who apologized with charming Italian inflection for traffic delays that had not actually occurred, because she had been waiting in a cafe 3 blocks away until Marco sent the signal that timing was optimal for maximum impact. 8 guests occupied chairs when she arrived, their faces representing the international film financing ecosystem that funded productions ranging from art house dramas screening at festivals to commercial thrillers designed for global distribution across theatrical markets and streaming platforms. Beaumont sat at the head of the table between a French producer named Antoine Mercier, who specialized in literary adaptations, and a Lebanese businessman introduced as Rashid Haddad, who claimed to operate an entertainment consulting firm in Beirut, but whose body language and security awareness suggested military or intelligence training that went far beyond the typical background of someone who advised producers on Middle Eastern co-production opportunities. Mary took the empty seat across from Haddad, positioning herself where she could observe his interactions with Beaumont while maintaining the appearance of an actress grateful for inclusion among industry professionals whose connections could advance her career beyond the limited opportunities available to performers who relied solely on talent without understanding how business relationships determined which projects received funding and which scripts remained unproduced despite their artistic merit. She noticed immediately how Beaumont deferred to Haddad on certain topics, how their conversation contained references that suggested shared history beyond simple business association, how they switched from French to Arabic for brief exchanges that excluded other guests from understanding discussions that clearly involved subjects they preferred to keep private from people whose discretion had not been tested through years of collaboration. The first course arrived with champagne that cost more per bottle than most independent films budgeted, for an entire day of shooting, Taittinger Comte de Champagne, that Beaumont ordered specifically because he enjoyed explaining to guests why he selected particular vintages based on their historical significance and production methods that distinguished superior champagne from merely expensive champagne consumed by people who purchased status without understanding quality. Conversation flowed through topics that included the competitive selection at Cannes that year, debates about whether streaming platforms were destroying theatrical distribution or expanding audience access to diverse content, and speculation about which films would receive the Palme d'Or, despite widespread agreement that jury politics mattered more than artistic excellence when determining awards that could transform a director's career or validate a producer's decision to finance projects. That critics would either celebrate as visionary or dismiss as self-indulgent failures that wasted resources on narratives without commercial appeal. Mary contributed observations about performance techniques, discussing how certain directors created environments where actors could access emotional authenticity, while others imposed controlling visions that reduced performers to instruments executing predetermined interpretations that limited the spontaneous discoveries possible when talented actors inhabited characters with sufficient freedom to explore psychological complexity beyond what existed in written scripts. Beaumont watched her throughout the meal with attention that went beyond typical attraction to beautiful women who spoke intelligently about subjects that interested him, asking questions that probed her background with increasing specificity as courses progressed from langoustine to Dover sole to rack of lamb prepared with herbs from Provence. He wanted to know about her training at the Silvio D'Amico Academy in Rome, which directors she admired most, and why, what drew her to roles requiring psychological transformation rather than simple romantic leads that showcased beauty without demanding technical skill, and whether she planned to transition into directing eventually, as many Italian actresses had done, after establishing their reputations through performances that demonstrated understanding of cinema beyond their own contributions in front of cameras. Mary answered with the detailed knowledge that came from actually having attended the academy under her cover identity, drawing on genuine experiences from 4 years of training that had been real, even though her ultimate purpose had nothing to do with building an acting career, and everything to do with creating a legend that could withstand investigation from intelligence services or criminals who vetted people before allowing them access to operations that could not tolerate infiltration by foreign agents. Rashid Haddad excused himself after the main course, stepping onto the restaurant's terrace to smoke a cigarette and make a phone call that lasted 7 minutes. According to the watch, Mary checked discreetly while appearing to listen to Antoine describe his latest project, adapting a Marguerite Duras novel. Through the window, she observed Haddad's posture shift during the conversation, his shoulders tensing and his free hand moving in gestures that suggested he was receiving information that created urgency or concern about matters that required immediate attention or decision-making that could not wait until after dinner concluded and guests departed to attend midnight screenings or private parties hosted at villas in the hills above Cannes. When he returned to the table, his demeanor had changed subtly, the relaxed engagement replaced by distraction that made his subsequent contributions to conversation feel performative rather than genuine, as though his mind was processing calculations that had nothing to do with film financing or festival politics and everything to do with operational concerns that superseded social obligations. Dessert arrived with digestives that Beaumont selected individually for each guest based on their preferences expressed throughout the evening, demonstrating the kind of attentive hospitality that made people feel valued and understood in ways that created loyalty beyond simple business transactions. He proposed a toast to new collaborations and friendships formed during festivals that brought together creative talents and financial resources necessary to transform ideas into films that audiences would remember long after the champagne bottles were empty and the lights dimmed in theaters, where stories flickered across screens to illuminate something true about human experience, despite all the artifice required to create those moments of recognition. The sentiment felt rehearsed but sincere, delivered by a man who genuinely believed in cinema's cultural value, even as he used film investment as cover for moving money that financed terrorism and enabled wanted criminals to disappear through surgical transformation. Beaumont invited Mary to join a smaller group for drinks at a bar near the Palais, but Rashid declined and excused himself with apologies about an early morning meeting with distributors from Dubai. Mary watched the Lebanese businessman leave, noting how he paused briefly to speak with Beaumont in Arabic before departing. Their exchange lasting less than 10 seconds, but carrying weight that suggested shared understanding about matters that transcended the evening's social gathering. Marco intercepted with a reminder about a breakfast meeting with a potential co-producer, giving Mary an exit that allowed her to decline Beaumont's invitation without seeming disinterested in continuing their conversation. Instead, creating anticipation for future encounters by suggesting her schedule was full of professional obligations, rather than indicating availability that might make her seem desperate for attention from men whose interest in her could advance her career. The encrypted message arrived on her modified BlackBerry at 11:37 that night, while she was removing makeup in her hotel bathroom. Yael had identified a wire transfer of €1,200,000 from a Beirut account to one of Beaumont's Geneva holdings. The transfer had been initiated 2 hours earlier. The amount matched payments associated with Bashir's highest value procedures. Someone important was about to get a new face. Mary had 48 hours to determine who the client was and where the surgery would take place. The dinner party had been preparation. The real operation was about to begin. Beaumont called Mary's hotel room at 9:15 on May 17th, inviting her to lunch at his villa in Mougins, where he wanted to discuss financing for Marco's proposed production and introduce her to a doctor friend who appreciated classical Italian cinema and collected photographs of actresses from the 1950s whose beauty reminded him of a more elegant era before digital manipulation replaced genuine talent with manufactured perfection. The invitation contained everything Mary needed to confirm that Bashir would be present at a location where Mossad could execute capture without French police interference, but accepting too eagerly would trigger suspicion from a banker who had survived 16 years of intelligence operations by recognizing when people wanted access to his network for reasons that extended beyond legitimate business relationships or social climbing ambitions, common among actors seeking wealthy patrons. She hesitated for exactly 4 seconds before accepting, long enough to suggest she was considering her schedule, but not so long that it appeared she was calculating implications beyond a simple lunch invitation. Marco drove her to Mougins in a rented Mercedes at 12:30, following GPS coordinates that led them through narrow roads, climbing into hills above Cannes, where villas concealed behind stone walls and cypress trees housed the kind of wealth that preferred privacy over ostentation and security over visibility. The villa occupied 3 hectares overlooking valleys, planted with olive groves and lavender fields that created pastoral beauty, designed to make guests forget they were minutes away from the Mediterranean coast, where crowds consumed the festival's spectacle of celebrity and commerce. 2 men in dark suits watched from the driveway, their positions suggesting professional security rather than domestic staff hired to park cars and serve drinks. Bashir stood on the terrace wearing linen clothing that suggested a doctor on holiday, rather than a surgeon who had transformed 43 terrorists into anonymous men who walked European streets without fear of recognition by intelligence agencies that had memorized their original faces from attack footage and surveillance photographs. He greeted Mary with the courtly formality of someone educated in French universities and trained in Beirut hospitals before the civil war transformed Lebanon into a landscape where medical skills became commodities purchased by militias and terrorist organizations willing to pay premium rates for services that legitimate institutions would never provide. His hands showed the steady confidence that came from thousands of hours performing procedures requiring microscopic precision. Fingers that had reshaped bone and cartilage to erase identities and create new faces that allowed wanted men to disappear into populations where no one would suspect the baker or accountant had once commanded operations that killed civilians in attacks designed to terrorize populations and destabilize governments. Lunch progressed through 4 courses, while conversation touched on Fellini and Visconti, the decline of Italian cinema compared to its golden age during the 1960s, and whether contemporary directors possessed the visual artistry and psychological insight that characterized the greatest films, from an era when auteurs controlled their visions without interference, from producers obsessed with commercial returns and audience testing that reduced art to market research. Bashir spoke about beauty as a construct that surgeons could engineer through technical mastery, comparing his work to sculpture where the medium was living tissue that healed and adapted according to principles that combined medical science with aesthetic judgment, that distinguished competent practitioners from artists who understood how small changes in proportion and symmetry could transform not just appearance, but the psychological relationship between an individual and their reflected self-image. Mary asked about his most challenging case, framing her question as curiosity about problem-solving in high-stakes environments where mistakes carried permanent consequences. Bashir smiled and mentioned a client scheduled to arrive that evening from Damascus, someone important enough that the procedure required 3 assistants and equipment transported from a private clinic in Geneva. He checked his watch. 17 hours until surgery. Everything he said was being recorded by the modified BlackBerry in Mary's purse that transmitted encrypted audio to Yael's analysis station in Tel Aviv, where technicians would confirm voice patterns matched Bashir's profile, despite 17 years of having only fragmentary recordings from compromised operations. The signal went out at 4:30. Avi authorized immediate extraction. Marco received confirmation through an encrypted text while pretending to photograph Mary on the terrace with Beaumont and Bashir visible in the background. A souvenir image that would document the moment when 17 years of hunting ended not with violence, but with a French counterterrorism unit that Mossad had alerted through intelligence-sharing agreements that allowed Israeli operations on European soil as long as arrests appeared to result from French investigative work rather than foreign espionage activities that would create diplomatic complications. French authorities arrived at 6:45 with warrants based on evidence that Mossad had been accumulating since 1997. Bashir and Beaumont were arrested without resistance. The client from Damascus never arrived. Mahmoud al-Rantisi, the man whose face was scheduled for transformation, was captured 4 months later in Amman after Israeli intelligence identified him through surveillance that would have been impossible if Bashir had completed the procedure. Dr. Karim Bashir received 18 years in French prison for conspiracy to commit terrorism and money laundering. He served 11 years before dying from pancreatic cancer in 2014 at a prison hospital outside Paris. Jean-Pierre Beaumont cooperated with authorities and entered witness protection after testifying against 37 clients whose accounts had financed operations across Europe and the Middle East. Rashid Haddad disappeared and was never located despite international warrants. Mary Levi continued operating under various identities until she retired from Mossad in 2009. She opened an acting school in Tel Aviv, where she taught method techniques to students who never knew their instructor had once used those same skills to hunt terrorists across 3 continents. Marco Santini became chief of European operations and ran intelligence networks until his death from a heart attack in 2019. Yael Cohen received promotions that led to directing financial intelligence for Mossad, where she continued tracking money that funded terrorism until her retirement in 2022. Avi Shaltiel attended Bashir's funeral in France. He wanted to see the man who had erased so many faces finally reduced to a photograph on a coffin that no one came to mourn.